I'm going to read it, I apologize. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Déana Scipio. Dr. Scipio is no stranger to the Bay Area. Before starting graduate school, she worked as an educator at the Exploratorium and as part of a number of other science and environmental education programs in the area. She earned her PhD from the University of Washington, where she studied with Phil Bell and was a member of the Institute for Science and Mathematics Education, as well as the Life Center, learning in informal and formal environments. Her dissertation was called Developing Mentors, Adult Participation, Practices, and Learning in an Out-of-School Time STEM Program. And it evidences a deep commitment to broadening participation in STEM through the careful design of out-of-school experiences and supports, as well as through personal relationships and civic engagement, which cuts across all her work since then. The dissertation explores mentorship within an out-of-school chemical oceanography program, where everyone from high school youth all the way to practitioners engaged in water-based science experiences together. I was very lucky to overlap with Dr. Scipio for some time in Boston, where she joined Turk as a postdoctoral scholar working with Anne Roseberry and Beth Warren. And I was thrilled when I learned she would be returning to California as a postdoctoral scholar and senior researcher, working with Heidi Ballard at UC Davis's Center for Community and Citizen Science. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scipio.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Michelle. I'm really delighted to be with you. Thank you all for coming today. And so today I just want to talk to you a little bit about authoring joy and thinking about multimodal artifacts as tools for broadening definitions of STEM participation. So I was watching a couple of your colloquium presentations, and I noticed that they have a more informal feel than a "this is a research talk." So I'm going to give you a little bit of my research interests, talk about the research context that Michelle mentioned, which we call Project COOL, which stands for Chemical Oceanography Outside the Lab. So you have to come up with a good name when you're going to work with middle school students. Pedagogies of Joy, which is really where this concept of using these multimodal artifacts to think about broadening participation intersects. And then authoring joy, specifically thinking about how young people make artifacts and share them in moments of joy. And then wrapping it back around to talking about broadening participation, because that is the thing that, as Michelle said, motivates my work. So I'm going to give you these handy signposts as we go through, and hopefully it won't seem very meandering. So these are my research interests writ large. So I'm really interested in broadening participation, not just thinking about adding more people to existing STEM paradigms, but redefining what it means to participate in STEM. And I've done that in a variety of different ways. So some of it is designing STEM out of school time, OST, programming. Some of it's connected to understanding the cultural learning pathways of scientists from non-dominant communities. And then I've worked with undergraduate scientists and studied how they were learning in practice during their participation in our out-of-school time learning context. And right now, the work that I'm doing at UC Davis in the Center for Community and Citizen Science is really focused on thinking about youth participation in community and citizen science. And what can we learn about these settings that this work happens in, as well as understanding youth participation and how we connect to it, and how they see themselves in this work. So fundamentally, I'm a design-based researcher. I work in out-of-school time environments for the most part, and then I'm really trying to think about how we can understand broadening participation through the experiences of all these multiple kinds of stakeholders in these multiple contexts. So I want to talk with you a little bit about sort of the conceptual territory that I'm swimming in, the conversations that I want to be a part of. And some of it is really creating these rich accounts of the experiences of youth from non-dominant communities while they're in out-of-school time learning settings. The other piece is thinking about the role that out-of-school time environments can play in broadening participation narratives for young people. And then also connecting those out-of-school time environments and thinking about them through the lens of design, which is what connects deeply to the learning sciences community. I'm trying to think about what it means to consider an environment a layered learning environment. So Michelle mentioned it earlier. I'm trying to think about an out-of-school time program with scientists, graduate students, undergraduate students, middle school students, education facilitators, folks that are chemical oceanographers, as an environment where there's multi-directional learning. The scientists are learning things, the middle school students are learning things, the educators, everyone is having an experience that's moving them along through a developmental trajectory. And it's through this sociocultural interaction of these multiple stakeholders that we have this design space for learning. And the work that I'm doing now is really trying to understand how young people develop environmental science agency, which is based upon Angie Calabrese Barton and Junki Basu's work on critical physics agency, to try to think about what that looks like in community and citizen science projects that are facilitated by natural history museums. So that project's called Learn, Sit, Sci. Just a teaser, I'm not actually going to tell you more about that today, but we'd be happy to follow up with folks afterwards. So, placeholder to tell you a little bit more about the research context. So, Project COOL, as I mentioned, was Project Chemical Oceanography Outside the Lab. And we had to come up with a really interesting name, middle school students. And its mentors, grads who are both graduate and undergraduate students, some of them science majors, some of them not. Youth in middle and high school, because as a design-based research project, we iterated over multiple years. So my dissertation data corpus was over 6 years of design-based research, artifacts, interviews. It's pretty massive. And then the research scientists who were both chemical oceanographers working in the SoundCitizen lab, as well as learning scientists working at ISME. So thanks for the generous support of the National Science Foundation for moving this work forward. And what we were doing was design-based research to understand broadening STEM participation, specifically in the geosciences. So chemical oceanography is the study of water. It's the study of what's happening chemically within water samples. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So the course itself, the research project, was a 2-quarter university course. We were working with undergraduates or graduate students. They were experiencing the cool out-of-school time curriculum as if they themselves were learners. We're focusing on science learning so they could learn the content, and really having them bounce back and forth between their science experience as learners and then their pedagogical experience, because they were going to think about how they facilitate this with young people. And then in the spring, they went into schools and started facilitating the program. And that debrief, planning, and reflection happened in collaboration with us at the university. And so they had 2 quarters of coursework with us. And then the out-of-school time program itself was another aspect of COOL, and this was running at multiple sites. And young people were engaging in contemporary ocean sciences. They were studying fish feminization, and they were looking at plasticizers and the impact of those chemicals on biological systems. And the students were also developing personally relevant projects within this context and leveraging the resources of the Chemical Oceanography Lab. So a little bit about the mentor cohort demographics. We skewed female. We had a large representation of ethnic backgrounds, a wide age range because this is undergraduates all the way up to graduate students, and a wide variety of majors and or graduate studies. And I feel like one of the things that's really important to consider in this context, and I did in my dissertation as well, is why is it that women in sciences from non-dominant backgrounds are seeking out a program like ours? For the undergraduates, this was, we were able to give them course credit, but it was not something that was part of their degree program. For the graduate students, they often were taking time away from other things that their PIs might have wanted them to do to engage in this type of work, but it was feeding something for those students. And our youth participant demographics, we have a equally wide representation of backgrounds, 6th through 12th grade, because we started with the program in high school and then transitioned into middle school. We have also skewing more female, but that has more to do with the fact that in the design we experimented with a female-only after-school program but we were responsive to the needs of the schools that we worked in. And so when a school asked us to make it co-ed, we did. And then we had multiple contexts as well. In the very first year, the young people were working in the SoundCitizen lab itself. They came to the university. Subsequent years, we worked at these 3 middle schools. Some Marble we worked with all the way through, and both Agate and Topaz were single years, having to do with lots of infrastructure. I don't know how many of y'all work in out-of-school time, but there's a lot of turnover. Sometimes the programs get completely revamped from one year to the next, and we had to be responsive to that as well. So the study design, this is design-based research, deeply ethnographic methods using field notes, participant observation, interviews, semi-structured interviews over multiple years. We had guided reflections, including notebook entries, philosophy of education, cognitive maps. So this is just the data corpus, both for the mentor participants and the youth participants. Then we have many interviews with all participants over time, as well as video of pretty much all of the intervention. So as you can imagine, this is a much broader data set than I will talk about today. So I want to talk a little bit about how you pull off something like this. You don't do it by yourself. There's a research team, PIs, PhD students from the learning sciences, as well as the PIs and lab technicians and researchers in ocean sciences who were processing our data, teaching the young people how to do it themselves, opening up the lab space, and as well as staff from community-based organizations. And so my role, PhD in learning sciences, that was how I jumped in. But I have to talk a little bit about what participant observer means for me. And within this context, I was a teacher, designer, liaison, coordinator, curriculum developer, researcher, et cetera, everything but the kitchen sink. And I think that that's part of the design-based research process, that you're in what's going on in a way that perhaps other types of research, it might be possible to keep some distance, but I haven't found that to be a possible thing. Not that I was seeking it, but maybe that's why DBR really resonated with me. But my role, I feel like, allowed me to build and nurture and sustain relationships with the participants that have informed the work, and I feel like made it better, because we were able to do constant member checking and also able to have conversations about the things that I was finding, and they were able to push back against things that didn't work for them. So I want to transition now that you have an understanding of the context that this work is happening in, to talk about pedagogies of joy. So this was a session that we presented at AERA 2017. It was part of the SAILR, which is Informal Learning Environments Research Group. And we were really trying to think about the intersection of joy and learning pathways. And multiple researchers participated in this symposium that I organized. Danielle Kiefer talked about exploring playful adaptation of family inquiry practice. So she was looking very closely through conversation analysis at things that were happening for one young person and how that young person used laughter and playfulness within her family to reshape things. We had Dave Greenberg and Angie Calabrese Barton talking about examining joy in critical relation to oppression and supportive structures. So they were in the Get City environment, thinking about young people transforming, designing, and answering questions about their own communities. Sarah Hagenow was looking at laughter and the role that it played in repositioning young people, developing comfort, pride, and really thinking about that as not a sidebar, but as an intrinsic part of productive science learning. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is an extension of this talk, really exploring hybrid STEM identity artifacts as manifestations of joyful learning, and how do you trace that through as a particular tool for broadening participation. And then we had Dean Grosslander as our discussant. So I want to talk to you a little bit about pedagogies and the way that we're taking up that word. So there are multiple ways that people have talked about pedagogy over time, and these are the ones that really resonate with us as a group and resonate with me as a scholar. And to me, the thing that's in common across these different ways of thinking about pedagogy is an attention to the experiences of participants. that we're not making an external definition of what joy is. We're trying to think about it through the context of the participants' experience and how joy was an organizing force for the type of work that young people were engaged in. And I feel like this is happening as well in these approaches to thinking about pedagogy. We're also thinking about collaboration, and there's a lot of collaborative space within these ways of thinking about pedagogy as well. And I think that the layered learning environments is also reflected quite well in these approaches to thinking about pedagogy. The pedagogy of the oppressed, for example, where we're not just thinking about the oppressed people and their needs, but also how their oppression hurts the oppressors as well. So this is an environment where it's not a single experience that shapes what it means to participate. And when I think about joy, I'm really trying to think about it in these terms, as play and creativity, but also as an expression of affect in the way that Jabert and Hammer talk about it. Also thinking about how joy sustains and allows for deepening of participation in the way that Holland and Lee, Carol Lee talk about this. And I feel like I would be remiss without thinking about what the power of, and perhaps peril, of talking about joy in times of fear. And for me, I'm really thinking about joy as an act of critical resistance. And this is present across the other studies in our symposium as well. We are pushing against these narratives of participation that could be catastrophizing narratives. There are no young people of color going into STEM fields, and because of that, all these terrible things will be happening to those young people and also to our communities. But I'm sort of taking up the challenge that Jean laid out to the room full of researchers at ICLS when it was in Colorado. And she said, what are people doing? How are they making sense of their environments? And how can we focus on that as the narratives that are important? And I also think that there are particular narratives that come from this catastrophizing frame about types of participants and also kinds of people who may or may not want to participate in terms of smartness or gender identity, ethnic backgrounds. So for me, I'm also trying to think about how joy sustains community and activity. What does that look like? And the power of joy to desettle expectations in the way that Megan Bang, Anne Roseberry, Beth Warren, and Doug Nadine think about it, as well as how joyful learning really centers design in the same ways that those pedagogies were centered on analysis and activity of learners' experiences, trying to think about how the learner's experience becomes the focus when we're looking for moments of joy. And I don't think that I'm alone in thinking about joy in a time of fear. I don't know how familiar you all are with these two movements to thinking about joy as resistance. But Black Men Smile, created a month after the death of Michael Brown. Pictures on Tumblr and Instagram of Black men smiling. Black Joy in the Hour of Chaos, Mark Van Joseph, who is a spoken word poet from the Bay Area and performer. He performed this piece in New York City right around the time when fear was descending upon us as a society. Thinking about also the Black Joy Parade and how these are counter narratives to what it might mean to be a non-dominant participant. So now, authoring joy. How does this connect to the research? So I'm going to play you a short video of Ayana, and we will come back to this and talk about it a little bit more deeply, but I want to start with the song, and as you watch this, look for what you might consider to be joyful in this. I would be joyful if the technology works. So This is Déana. Can you just shout out some things that you see in this particular moment? What do you notice?
She's smiling
Smiling.
and singing.
So the person standing is one of the mentors in the program, an undergraduate mentor. There's another student sitting across from her. And did you recognize the activity they were doing, the Cups song? So this is the Cup song that was popularized by Anna Kendrick, I think, but there's YouTube videos before that in Pitch Perfect. And it's a way of keeping rhythm while singing. And she taught it to everybody. She was an expert in the Cups method, which I can attest is quite difficult to learn. And she had spent hours on YouTube and practicing so that she was an expert in this. And when we asked her, well, can we create a song that would tell the next year's participants what our after-school program is like, she said, I got this. And what we did was on this whiteboard that was swiveling back and forth was write the actual lyrics to the song. And then we began to erase those lyrics and insert experiences from the pool program. The things that she remembered, the things that felt important to her. And I would argue that this is a significant science artifact. This is something that represents her experiences, her background, where she's coming from. It's also something that speaks about the experiences she had in the pool program. Before we dive more deeply into analyzing that as an artifact and as a representation of her science experience, I want to pull back out to talk more about broadening participation and the persistent metaphor that we use for broadening participation. How many folks are familiar with this particular image or this concept, right? Where you've got a ton of people coming into careers, and then they go to high school, and there's a drop-off, and then they go into later studies, and then by the time you get to the end, this is very blurry, I'm not quite sure why. It's not quite blurry on my screen. But at the end, you've got people who are STEM graduates. These are the folks that are going to be the engineers, mathematicians, researchers, the practitioners, and the theorists in STEM spaces. I would like to draw your attention to the drain, the grate. I'd like to draw your attention to the drips and the folks that fall out of the pipeline, and really to think about myself. I am the drip. I hit organic chemistry and decided I'm not sure that I'd like to be a vet after all. Maybe I'll do something else with my life. And I want to think about what this particular image of broadening participation creates and as a metaphor. So as you might imagine, I'm not a huge fan. However, I do think that this particular image has motivated a lot of progress within science education and also within science ed policy, and also provided opportunities for advancement of new ideas, new innovations, new implementation of things that really needed to happen within our field. But it really is focused on need to increase non-dominant community participation in STEM. Yes, let's do that. It's really invested in adding more people from non-dominant backgrounds to STEM careers, to fields, degrees. Yes, let's do that too. I'm not as enamored of the workforce argument frame that it brings to the conversation. And the global competition narrative, I think, is part of the catastrophizing rhetoric around what it might mean to be a nation without STEM graduates and STEM participants. But I'm not really sure that the pipeline metaphor is doing all the things that we would like it to do long term, especially in a design-based context. So when I think about troubling the pipeline, I'm doing that because I think that it promotes ever-narrowing definitions of what STEM participation looks like. I think that it is really giving us a frame where participants are either passive droplets flowing through a pipe that we don't know what's happening inside of that pipe. And it also gives us these drips that get flushed down the drain. I think that it privileges an assimilationist narrative. That to be able to participate in STEM, you will learn to do it in these ways. And then you'll land in the cup instead of going down the drain. And I think that from a design and education context, what that does is it makes us into plumbers. So now we have to fix the pipe because the pipe is leaky, or the pipe is broken, or the pipe is blocked. So now we're creating interventions that are oriented towards doing those things rather than just trying to figure out whether we should have a pipe at all. And I'm not the only one thinking about this. There are many other scholars in this space trying to think about STEM to whose ends for what ends. And it's a question that I'm trying to pick up. So now, hopefully this doesn't feel like whiplash. Let's go back to looking at Ayana's song within the context of broadening participation, both troubled and canonical. So I'm using the frame of Angie Calabrese Barton, Edna Tan, and Anne Rivette's work to think about songs. So they mention this in one of their pieces. They see the Bone Song, which is a song that one of the young people in their program in a classroom wrote, where she was the head bones connected to the neck bone, and this has helped her remember all of the different bones in the body. And they're saying that this song illustrates how signature science artifacts serve as resources for entering into the science classroom discourse community with positions of authority without having to assimilate into the normative culture of the science classroom. So think about Ayana's song through that frame. Is this a canonical representation of science practice and science participation? Or is this pushing against and resisting the narratives of what participation should look like and what successful STEM participation might engage? So when I talk about authoring in this particular context, I'm thinking about how we look at Ayana's song and how we look at more canonical representations of authoring in STEM. And I'm trying to raise the concept of authoring on the right as perhaps more easily recognizable as science artifact. And why is that? Why is this particular artifact that contains many of the same elements present in the song and the other songs of young people in the program? Why are we more prepared to think about this science poster that went to AGU, which was fantastic? I'm so glad the young people did that. They had an opportunity to present in front of a room full of other scientists. They were positioned as experts. And think about Barton, Rivette, Tan's words about how the song positioned their young person within the context of the science classroom, to share her work, to be an expert in that space. So as we go through the next couple slides, what I really want you to be thinking about are how are signature science artifacts serving as tools for broadening participation and definitions of that within STEM. So I'm going to focus from that giant data corpus that I mentioned before just on the participant-generated artifacts here. I'm also going to think very specifically, using this concept from Dewey, about the principle of continuity of experience. Thinking about the ways that every experience both takes up something from the ones that have come before and then modifies in some way the things that are going to come after. And I'm also trying to think about how contexts are defined by participants orienting to an event as a case of something. So in this particular context, I'm trying to think about how are the participants orienting to the case of joy, a moment of joy. And I'm doing this by looking at the signature science artifact that we have, so the song lyrics, the performance, the video, trying to think about this as a joyful learning moment, placing it within the context that the artifact was shared, and then going backwards to think about what the contributing elements to this particular artifact might be, and then thinking forwards to how that particular artifact functioned within our program to modify what we consider participation to be and to modify perhaps the young people's experience of themselves within our program. So we had a variety of different kinds of artifacts that were created, some of them made by the undergraduates in the program, and just wanting to bring back up this poster that the young people presented at EGU. Because when I think about authoring, these are all moments of young people sharing the experiences they've had, communicating the science that they wanted to new communities, and also injecting parts of themselves into new spaces. So let's go back to Lindsay's cool song. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to read the text. We're going to come back and get to the text in a minute. But this song was shared at a talent show, which was at the end of the first quarter of the Cool program. So we'd spent a quarter, 10 weeks with the young folks talking about all this different research. They were learning about fish feminization. They were jumping into those spaces. And then we said, we're going to have a talent show. And we had one young woman who did, I promise you, almost 5 minutes of Mr. T quotes. Almost entirely. Pity the fool, pity the fool, pity the fool. I did not know there were so many different ways to prosody for that particular statement, but she almost got to 5 minutes of it. Then this particular talent show for Lindsay, she performed this song, and qualitative researcher fail, we do not have a video of her performing the song because we chose instead to treat it as a party and a celebration as opposed to a data collection moment. Perhaps never again, I don't know. It seemed like the right choice at the time. But what happened when Lindsay performed this song, because this is based on a Justin Bieber song, and I never thought I would quote Justin Bieber in my dissertation, but there you go. So there were laughter and groans from her compatriots because many people, even in 6th grade, back in 2010, 2011, they were not Justin Bieber fans, as perhaps we might have thought they would all be. So Lindsay's bringing her personal love of all things Bieber into this space. She's also injecting her experiences in Cool into the lyrics. What happened for Lindsay is now she starts to think that science can be more fun. I'm not trying to argue that this is the song that made her change this experience, but the entire time that she spent in the Cool program. And I felt like this particular moment of joy, laughter, sharing was for her a moment where she put herself out there and shared something that was personal to her with us as a group. For us, it started to shift our idea of what the final moment might look like and led us to designing for an in-school performance mode as a part of our program. When we started, we thought, after-school program, broadening participation in science, the young people must go out into the world and present their work, which is still very important. But we also realized that they needed opportunities to present their work to their community in their school. And so for us, Lindsay's song and the way that she shared it helped to reshape that for us as designers. So here's Lindsay's song. And I'm not going to read it because she didn't read it when she presented it to us. So you can sing along if you know the chorus when I get to it. You're swimming in it and it's cold. We're going sailing 'cause we're bold. It is the sea, it is the sound, and it will always, always, always be around. There's too much trash, it's getting dirty. We've got to save it for fish and birdies, and for the salmon, and for the bears. So it will always, always, always be there. And now it's like Puget, Puget, Puget Sound, oh, Puget, Puget, Puget Sound, oh, Puget, Puget, Puget Sound. I thought you'd always be mine. So here's this young woman bringing her love of all things Bieber into this space. And I really want to point out her commitment to maintaining the rhyming scheme. These are the actual, this is how she printed out the song. So she could have written just cold, but she was really wanting to make sure that, because I asked her, could you give me the copy of the lyrics? And she's like, it's really important, that's how he does it, you gotta do that. So she's really committed to maintaining the rhyme scheme. She's really incorporating a lot of the societal narratives about trash and about pollution. We can talk about how that's a catastrophizing narrative, but there we go. This is her construct, the problem statement that she's putting out there. This is why we have to do it. Then we've got her incorporating elements of the Cool experience. So we studied water in Project Cool, Girls in Science, we always rule, we'll keep on learning and go to school, and we will always, always be cool. Cool program. I was like, yeah. But here we have, I feel like, a representation of this young person's commitment. We have a counter narrative of STEM participation. And we're really honoring heterogeneity of experience. Not everybody in the program felt exactly like this, but I will tell you that these young women were sick. There were 6 of them who were in 6th grade when they began the program. They started to eat lunch together. They hang out at each other's houses. They created a uniform for Project Cool. They all wore Converse and jeans and a t-shirt we gave them when they came to visit the university for the first time. And this signature science artifact captures the place where she's doing her work, a societal narrative about why this work is important, a context for describing what it was like for her in the Cool program. And we didn't prompt her to make something like this. We said, you can do whatever you want, as evidenced by the Mr. T quotes during the talent show, and this is what she chose to bring to us. So I want to do a similar kind of analysis for Ayana's Cool song. So here's again, don't worry, don't try to read that, that's not the point there. Again, we asked her, we prompted Ayana, right? Learning again from Lindsay's song as maybe this is a way for young people to show a different aspect of themselves and bring something else to the table in a science context. We said, could you make a song that would help people think about what it's like to participate in this type of project? And it was a collaborative effort. So she took the lead because of her cups expertise, and she was really a cups pattern enthusiast. But it was a collaborative effort. We were all sitting around, giant whiteboard, crossing out things, adding in things, saying, actually that one doesn't fit, it's like the rhyme scheme is not right. Again, a deep commitment to maintaining that. And I think in Ayana's song, even more clearly, as we get to the next slide, you'll see how her cool experiences are also woven into this song. Now, what this translates into is a reorientation of expertise within our after-school program. So we had initially said to our young people, we would like you to think about this as a collaborative space we're all going to be working together. We said to the facilitators, you're going to be mentors. And we asked them during their training period to remember times when they had worked with mentors in their life. In a club, with a coach, what was that experience like? Or maybe another after-school program that you participated in. Maybe your advisor at school, this person as a mentor to you. Because we wanted to start to reorient the out-of-school time experience where they weren't facilitators and teachers, but they were in it with the young people and collaborating. And this, when she was trying to teach them how to do the cups, all of us how to do cups, and we failed so dramatically, so frequently, it reorients where expertise lies and what expertise might be necessary to create something like this, to pull something like this off. And so it really helps to shift that notion of expertise within the program. So now to the text of Ayana's song, which you already heard, so I'm not going to sing. But we have really an appeal to others to join the project, right? She says, I got my lab coat for the long way round, 2 bottle chemicals for the way, and I sure would like some sweet company. Join Project Cool, what do you say? She's bringing this in. She also has a strong commitment to maintaining the rhyme scheme of this particular song. And she's really citing her personal experiences in Project Cool. So on the first day of the curriculum, what we ask young people to do is to take a sawed-off 2-liter bottle, flip the top upside down to make a funnel shape. And we've given them a bottle of water that I tried to make as dirty as possible. I put coffee grounds in there, I dug up dirt from the garden, I put some stones, I put twigs and leaves, whatever I could find, into this bottle of water. And then I spiked it with a tiny bit of ammonia because we wanted to help through this hands-on experience our young folks to start to think about what makes water clean or dirty and how can we tell. And specifically, she's got the ones with the smelliest of fumes because on that day, when I gave them their bottles of dirty water, I hadn't been able to find any coffee grounds, which typically would mask the scent of the ammonia. So they open these bottles and they get this huge fume. We talked about wafting, but it smelled like ammonia in the classroom. She's like, it's got bacteria, it's got chemicals, because now she knows that it's not just the horrible smell, but there's actually a chemical in there. and we pulled out test strips for them to dip in, and they realized that there was actually something present beyond what they could see in the water. And these are actually the words that she said. I tracked back to that day in the program when we were sharing this with them. She's like, what's in there? Is it cereal or something? So it's got bark that looks like cereal embedded in this signature science artifact. But it sure would be cleaner with you, because they took the time to clean it. They created their filters, they had all kinds of materials they could use, and some of them actually got it to look pretty clean, but since it had been spiked with ammonia, it wasn't actually clean. And so I want to think about these two signature science artifacts, also within the context of Eleanor Duckworth's words. She's saying there are two wonderful aspects to providing occasions for wonderful ideas. One is being willing to accept children's ideas. The other is providing a setting that suggests wonderful ideas to children. Different ideas to different children as they are caught up in the intellectual problems that are real to them. I feel when we position young people to only create canonical communication artifacts, what we're doing is constraining what it means to have a wonderful idea about science. And that presenting alternative pathways, not saying that one pathway is the best way, the other pathway is not the best way, but that we have multiple ways for people to engage in STEM. We have multiple ways for people to think about what it means to be a STEM participant. But what we're doing is suggesting or creating new spaces that suggest to young people that they might have a wonderful idea that they could share with us that's connected to STEM participation. So when I try to think about designing for joyful learning, I'm keeping this in mind and trying to think about how authoring, autonomy, creativity, play, hybridity, multimodality, desettling expectations, and a third space can involve and bring young people into STEM participation in ways that other types of representations or communications might not. And again, I'm not the only person trying to think about what this might mean to engage young people in alternative ways, new pathways, and how we might honor those. So to tie it all together, thinking about joy, authoring, and broadening participation, and really trying to consider answering these types of questions. Who participates? What does it mean to participate? And then who gets to decide what counts? So diving more deeply into broadening participation, I really want to think about redefining what we mean by STEM participation. Because I think that's how we begin to empower community participation. And this is why citizen science projects are so interesting to me in this particular postdoc. Thinking about community-based design research and how that can deeply connect to citizen science projects. Also, trying to think about how that expands what counts as questions. Who can be a participant? What counts as data? What counts as methods? What counts as analysis? And I feel like it's another way for us to consider addressing underrepresentation at the institutional and the individual level. But I also feel like what joy can help to do is to reframe narratives about individual participants that push us to think about the institutions and the spaces where young people might be able to share something like this. So when I'm redefining participation, I'm trying to think about how we can include the experiences of non-dominant communities and broadening what it means to include more than industry, tenure track, or research as the focus of participation. And I want to offer an alternative metaphor for thinking about broadening participation. So this comes from an edited volume by Michelle Branch, really pushing on the idea of roadways as a new way to think about STEM participation instead of a pipeline. And so this is a picture of Boston, and I can tell you this is an extremely interesting place to try to figure out how to navigate by vehicle. Michelle was nodding and smiling. So this is a map of many of the roads. I still don't think it's all the roads because I swear there's other little things in there. You figure that out when Siri's trying to tell you take a slight right because there's actually 5 rights that you can take. This seems ridiculous, but I promise you it's not. And I feel like roadways gives us a new way of thinking about what it might mean to broaden participation. That it privileges multiple pathways, teaching, out-of-school time work, pre- and in-service work within the community, STEM communication. How might people be entering and exiting roadways taking detours. What might it look like for some people who have an easier pathway? Maybe they're in the HOV lane to STEM participation. And I think that it offers us more things to think about instead of locating the onus of participation into perseverance and persistence and having it be housed within the individual. I think Roadways asks us to consider the infrastructure that's possible for people as they navigate their way into STEM spaces. So my current work is in the Center for Community and Citizen Science at UC Davis. And our leadership, Dr. Hank Ballard, Dr. Ryan Meyer, and myself. And then we're working with multiple graduate students as researchers. And we're really trying to consider what it might mean to provide opportunities for civic action, innovative science, conservation and management, science learning, and doing this within the context of a strong research initiative. What is community and citizen science, you may be wondering? Spaces where people collaborate with professional scientists, so very similar to the work that I did in my dissertation as well, because our professional scientists were part of the context. It often, but doesn't always, involve collecting data. It can involve analysis and all sorts of other things. It might include designing the research questions themselves and the methods, data analysis, interpretation, disseminating conclusions, decision-making audiences, deciding how to communicate. And then it specifically includes community-led projects. So this is the space that I'm trying to think about broadening participation in now. And our program, the current one, is called Learn, Sit, Sci, and we're studying environmental science agency development within the context of citizen science projects that are facilitated by natural history museums. And I'd, of course, be happy to talk about that more as well. And we have many, many people to thank. The cool participants, their families, the youth themselves, the cool research team, leadership team, Phil Bell, Andrew Schaus, Rick Kyle, Elaine Klein, Fan Kong, Kristen Bergsman, and then my mentors at the Shea Pune Center at Turk, and Anne Roseberry Benfoy, Mia Hong, and Eli Tucker Raymond, and then my writing partner, without whom many of these things would not be possible. I encourage some of the graduate students at lunch today to make sure to find a writing partner, because that's what gets you through. And I couldn't resist a little Black Panther in there. But I feel like what a wonderful way to think about what it might mean to redefine participation in STEM. So thank you all for coming. Questions? Thoughts?
So you talked about broadening participation and offered another metaphor with roadways. So where do you think those broader roads lead?
I think that they might lead to very different types of participation in STEM. It might be that participation is creating a citizen science project within your community to learn with and from elders about food sustainability. It might be getting a PhD in aeronautics and designing planes. It might be, there's many, many things that I can imagine STEM participation looking like. But I'm trying to think beyond the cup at the end. That's one of our participants was told, actually. You guys were back pocket slides. So MARINA, and she was an undergraduate biomedical engineering student, and she was told. She was one of our mentors in the program, and basically they told her there's 3 ways that you can be successful as a biomedical engineering student. You could go into industry and design devices. You could go to medical school and use the skills that you've learned, or you could also go back to school and become a professor of biomedical engineering, which wonderful, successful pathways, but a very narrow description of what it might look like. And in her words, I think, because we presented the pipeline metaphor to them, I was much less heavy-handed in our conversations about it. I just said, what do y'all think about this? And this was her response. But it's presenting such a narrowly defined definition, and as someone who's leaking out of the pipeline, her words, because she was choosing to become focused on science device communication, that she's acknowledging that a science degree, she wants to think about what it means to acknowledge that a science degree can be used in many different ways. And that diversity should be a good thing, not a drip falling down the drain because you didn't get into the cup. but perhaps a broader set of experiences that may be considered STEM participation.
So I have a perhaps predictable question for me, which is, most of this work is in out-of-school environments, and I'm thinking about those of us whose hearts live in schools,
Yes.
and the constraints of schools and students' expectations and experiences in schools, and where you see maybe some of those roads could be built in schools. What might that look like, and how could we promote it?
So again, earlier at lunch, I was thinking of talking with people about this formal, informal dichotomy, and I think it's not as productive a space to try to think about them as two separate spaces, but to try to think sort of as the Life Center does about the sea of blue, and then the path of orange. And my impetus is to think about the relationship between those spaces and try to think about navigation from one space to the next. And I'm not sure that school needs to be more like OST, or OST needs to be more like school. I feel like we need to have lots of opportunities for young people to have many different kinds of experiences. Because we didn't have as much time as we could have to really go in depth with a lot of the conceptual science behind the things that the young people were experiencing. We were able to dive deep on the questions that they raised and asked, and we were able to collaborate with our scientists and think about fish feminization and how that might impact the things that they wanted to study, which were plasticizers and chemicals in beauty products that contribute to these changes in biological systems. But that was one small slice that we were able to go in depth on. And I feel like we can't ignore the power of schools to give students a much broader experience of what science might look like. And so I feel like perhaps it's the ability to move between one and the next. That's where I would like to focus. Does that answer?
I work with mostly undergrads and recent grads in out-of-school settings, and they're getting hands-on research experiences. And students sometimes struggle with not having role models that look like them, whatever that means. It means different things to different people. And I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are about, a lot of what you're doing here is creating community and like a space for people to bring themselves into the STEM space. But sometimes, especially like at the undergraduate level and beyond, we're putting undergrads into spaces where people don't look like them or talk like them or act like them, and how to kind of reconcile bringing yourself into STEM when your professional development sort of requires you to be in a space where you may look or feel different. Or just what are your thoughts about that?
I have an entire dissertation chapter of thoughts about
Yes.
But I will say that the work of critical race theorists really helps to push my thinking about that. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm really invested in thinking about redefining participation. Because the trajectory that you're describing, that's the one that I find to be problematic and potentially assimilationist. Not that that's always what it looks like, or that's always the experiences that folks from non-dominant communities have when they move into these spaces, but I think recent work in cognition and instruction, McGee and, do you remember the co-authors? It's ringing bells for anybody. You can check it on that later. But it's a piece about the troubled success of Black women in STEM, and that their literature review really leverages critical race theory in a very powerful way to push back against the idea that persistence needs to be located within the individual, and really trying to help question what it means to be in a STEM space, and redefining what STEM spaces look like. And also, they were looking at the physical impact of going into spaces where you're not able to bring your whole self on the participants in that study. And in order to really make us question the safeness of STEM spaces. In my dissertation chapter, I talk a lot about navigation. and talk about that from the standpoint of the mentors themselves. This is 3 graduate student mentors who had themselves chosen to take time out of other things that they were doing to participate in creating a broadening participation environment for other young women of color. And they had very problematic and sort of tense relationships themselves with canonical STEM participation. And so they brought that to the table in our conversations with the middle school students. And I feel like that's part of the conversation of helping people navigate. And then there's work by Maria Ong, Lily Ko, and that group looking at persistence and resilience. But I think that that work is also very powerful because what it talks about are the strategies that people are using now. And I think that I don't want to make it seem like persistence is a horrible thing and we shouldn't be studying that, because that's the situation we have right now. I feel like some of my work is aspirational. This is the space I would like us to get to, and I have some ideas for how we could get there. But until we do, we need to help people move into these spaces and flourish in these spaces until we can change them.
I found that paper, so it's Newby and Bentley, 2017, Cognition and Instruction, and you can get the PDF for free on ResearchGate if you don't have access.
Awesome. It's fantastic. And it really helped me. Yes, something to cite. This is good.
Hi, I think it's fantastic work and really exciting to learn about. One of the questions I have for you is in your recent work, this combination of community and citizen science. I was curious as a group if you've encountered and are documenting the tensions you feel, because I know citizen science has often been framed as not very participatory, and those larger questions of who's benefiting, but also what side of science you're showing. And engaging folks in. So I was curious if in your current work you've been kind of mapping that out and been thinking about kind of key pillars or structures for that work.
So that's particularly interesting to me.
Yeah.
It hasn't been, it's not necessarily a design focus of the work that we're doing right now. We are studying learning environments and trying to understand the structures of those learning environments. And we're also studying youth participation, trying to understand what youth participation looks like in those spaces. But specifically, the lens that I bring to that work and that they wanted me to bring to that work is this equity-oriented focus and try and think about participation. However, Peggy's work prior to this has really focused on youth-focused citizen science, which is another space where what participation looks like can sometimes shift. People's ideas about canonical participation for young people. But I think that there's a fantastic piece that develops the environmental science agency frame. That's Ballard, Dixon, and Harris, and it's in biological conservation. If you ping me, I'll send you a link to it. But they are wrestling with that idea as well. And I feel like this is one of the reasons why the center is community and citizen science, and communities first, because it's another one of those spaces where there could be a dichotomy of top-down citizen science projects and bottom-up community science projects, and I think they're trying to think about the spectrum as opposed to locating them in 2 separate camps. You had a question too?
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it because it might have already been answered, but I think you said that persistence is the situation happening now, and you feel like your space is aspirational, and we want to help people while they are still going into those spaces until we can change them. I want to know, helping people going into those spaces, is that doing harm? I think you said yes, it is doing harm to those participants, like the physical impact of not being able to bring in your full self, but yet there's people like me, at least, that still wants people into those canonical spaces because that is the situation now. So I want to know, what is the harm in having those efforts instead of like maybe focusing all our effort on changing the situation entirely?
Well, that's, I think, why I'm trying to think about broadening participation as this tension between those two ideas. That we do want more participation, we do want more people, we do want to create interventions that bring more people into those contexts. and allow more people to be able to leverage those tools to answer their own questions and to help their own communities. But at the same time, I feel like we can't lose track or sight of the fact that adding numbers might not be the best place to focus all of our attention, and we are going to have to do both. And so I'm not trying to say stop doing persistence and go into change space. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that the world is as it is right now. We would like it to be different, but until it is, and I think in service of making it different, adding more people to existing STEM paradigms is still a very worthy goal. But let's not stop there.
Yeah.
There's a thing about broadening participation. It feels like, in terms of what you're saying, and my experience with other people who talk about it from a programmatic aspect, that it is about sort of, in some way what you do professionally or whatever ends up being about STEM. But I'm wondering how much, or if there is any talk about broadening participation as a means, like in spaces like your OTS.
Sorry, lots of acronyms.
It's really fine. But thinking about, I guess, as a means of teaching citizens about science as a lens, right? As a way to, like, as something that you can, as a tool that you can use, even if you're not on a roadway of science, that it is just something that you can have, that you can, we're all born as scientists, yada yada, and then we get socialized out of it, but I guess like trying to bring that back, even if you do end up as a historian, right, like trying to take a more like scientific approach to how you think about those questions, et cetera, but like, is that something that people think about when they talk about broadening participation, that it's not just, even with a broader idea about careers in STEM, like even if you don't end up in STEM, that science is a useful tool for you.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think that's something that I sometimes forget to say as part of broadening participation as well. Wonderful work being done in science literacy and thinking about not just how people might become scientists as the end point. And this is also something that came up in the dissertation work, where a lot of the graduate student mentors were pushing against the idea that a broadening participation program must turn out 12 little geoscientists at the end, and that would be our measure of success. But they were thinking about how the young people might be using science in order to do things that were personally consequential, and also scientifically rigorous, and also community development. And so that's to me one of the reasons why citizen science is so appealing as well. Because now you have a context in which people are learning potentially about some very specific thing in great depth, that then they can contribute, they have questions, they are able to perhaps leverage the resources of a larger scientific enterprise to serve their own needs, and that's sort of the community science model. But that even in the citizen science model, I feel like it's not the more top-down citizen science model, if that's one way to think about it, that the scientist defines the question and people perhaps will be contributing by collecting data or by analyzing data, that people are engaging and learning about the practices of science in ways that they could then use in their own lives. So the Environmental Science Agency triangle that Heidi, Colin, and Emily developed is, the first bucket is learning the practices of science. Learning of environmental and citizen science. The next bucket is about developing your own sense of the role that you want to play within that context, the things that you want to do, the things you want to figure out how to do really well. And then the third bucket is making change, using that expertise, leveraging that role into making change in your community. So I feel like the concept of science literacy, Noah Feinstein talks about this, Joe Coleman talks about this, two of the people off the top of my head. There's many other ways that folks are trying to think about what it might look like for communities to engage in science for their own purposes. So, great question, thanks. I don't know how we're doing for time.
You have another question?
Yeah. Or we could just talk. Good weight on the mic.
Well, I guess it's sort of related to the last question. so there's like science literacy, right? It's knowing content and practices, but then also having a better understanding of science as a community, right? And so like a thing that bugs me as someone who's trained as a scientist is like, science says that this thing is possible, right? Like you see it on Facebook, you see it right wherever, like hit pieces and articles, etc. But like, are there ways of using these types of spaces to teach people about like what, as a community of practice, what science is? Or is it, and I could see that might be too much to try to do, right? To both like engage people in like learning deeply about something and to understand a larger community they may not necessarily be a part of at that time. But I'm just wondering if that's possible, I guess.
I really hope so, because a lot of the questions that we are going to have to answer in the future are multi-directional, we need to be leveraging lots of different ways of knowing. We need to be leveraging lots of different expertise to try to figure these things out. And I think we need to be in interdisciplinary spaces. But that means that folks also need to have understandings of these sort of, I don't want to say that you can only begin to do work in STEM spaces once you have an understanding of the STEM space, because I think that that's what this talk is really pushing against, what it might mean to position yourself with an expertise that allows you to interact with the community. But I also think that those ways of interacting with the community and understanding who the community is and that science is not a thing. And there's as many different kinds and approaches to doing science, to what counts as data, to what counts as evidence, to what methodology looks like. And we can't ask everybody to read Bruno Latour, but it'd be awesome if we could. I think it would change perhaps the way that science knows all and will fix the world's ills, like better living through science. So I would hope that the more that people experience citizen science and have other opportunities to engage in broadening participation programming, that they might get a sense of the messiness of science and not see it as a point of contention, but see it as the way that science gets done. And that they might come to see, to understand more of this community of practice by participating. And that citizen science is one way to start to do that. I also think after-school programming is one way to start to do that. Undergraduate coursework is one way to start to do that. And I think there's multiple ways that hopefully we maintain the fact that there's multiple ways for people to engage and come to learn about the communities that are present underneath the umbrella of science.
I just have a question. Well, in sort of both those songs that you presented, there is like, I don't know, I guess I was struck by like the use of pop culture in this after school like science space. And so I guess I'm wondering like this idea of the use of like pop culture, bringing that into this space, like where does that, what are students sort of like doing with that, and like how do you think this comes into play with their authoring joy, or
Like what are students taking away from the fact that we brought pop culture in? Or
or that we could.
That they could bring it. Yeah. Well, I just keep thinking about hip hop ed and that finding ways to connect young people to the things that they care about and the things that they brought in. I think it would be very different if we had said, here's a song that we wrote about science, guys. And we picked, I don't know, it's a 50 Cent song. It would be 50 Cent, but it would probably be something more contemporary. That, to me, would feel more artificial and like placed upon the young people. I hope that what they took away from the space was that science could be fun, that they could do things that were interesting, that they could do things that matter to them, and that those things would be counted and be viewed as artifacts, and that they would be part of the work that we were doing together.
It's one of the things I really like about the Bieber example is that it's not like, hey, young people like rap, let's use a rap song, but it's something that's controversial among the youth community and some really identify with it. Reminds us that kids are human.
Yeah.
different interests.
Well, and I think with the hip hop ed work, I wouldn't necessarily say that we were going all the way in depth, the same kind of depth that Emden and his group do. Because we weren't asking them to leverage a different signifying modality that was part of their community and to write rap battle songs, like science battle songs. We weren't asking them to do that. But we just said, hey, what would you like to do to tell people about the program? What could we do? We made a video, like, let's write a song. Okay, cool, let's write a song. Other students did a video. There was a video of plasticized, it was about plasticizers, which are the chemicals that give plastics their malleability. You all probably are familiar with BPA, that's the most famous one because it was banned. But there's a whole other family of plasticizers, DBP, DEHP, that do the same thing and haven't been banned, so they're still in our plastic bottles. But the students had done this research and they went to AGU, that was the poster that they presented, and then when they got back, they wanted to share it with their community, and so they made a video, CSI style, where they arrested a plastic bottle, they tested the water in the bottle for plasticizers, and then the bottle was booked for crimes against humanity, for causing low sperm count and what did they say, low sperm count. It has an impact on female fertility, and the very worst thing, man boobs. It interferes with the signals that your body is sending to the tissues within your system by introducing artificial messages that might tell your body to do the same things that higher levels of estrogen. And so I would argue that that kind of artifact and the space to create both something that would be seen as this is a canonical STEM artifact and representation of what you learn, placed alongside a video or a song, would allow young people to think about science in this broader way, to think about communicating science, to think about communicating their ideas, and what would hopefully be a larger context of redefining what it means to participate. I'm so glad you all came to the talk. Thanks for such great questions.
Thank you so much.